So, you've watched as the specifications slowly leaked out over the past couple of months, and last week you saw it unboxed around the world via countless media outlets. Now though, the time has come for us to finally discover if AMD's latest and greatest high-end desktop CPUs are worth the asking price. Or are they just hot, power-hungry, overpriced silicon for suckers? Before we jump into the benchmarks, here's a quick look at the specifications one more time. For this comparison, we'll be testing the Threadripper 1950X 1920X along with the Ryzen 7 1700 and 1800X. Meanwhile, we'll also have some competition from Intel with the Core i7 7800X, 7820X and Core i9 7900X. When compared to the Ryzen 7 1800X, consumers are faced with a 75% price premium for the 1920X, and yet they do only get 50% more cores. That said though, you do get quad-channel memory support and significantly more PCI Express lanes with the Threadripper CPU. What I'm most interested in is how the Threadripper CPUs compare with Intel's Skylake X parts, and that's what we're here to find out. Finally, a quick note on the test system specs. For testing the Skylake X CPUs, we use the ASRock Fatality X299 Professional Gaming i9 motherboard, while the Threadripper CPUs were tested with the ASRock X399 Taishi. Both platforms were fitted with G-Skill's Trident Z DDR4 3200 CL14 64GB quad-channel memory kit, and a big thanks to G-Skill for providing all that memory. The X299 system was installed on the Praxis wet bench, and the cooler used was Thermaltake's Pacific RL custom liquid cooling kit. Meanwhile, Threadripper was tested on a sheet of foam on my desk using Thermaltake's Flowring RGB 360 all-in-one liquid cooler. Alright, enough chit-chat, let's get to it. Kicking things off, let's check out the memory bandwidth performance. As you probably know, the Ryzen 7 CPUs feature a dual-channel memory controller, whereas Threadripper offers quad-channel memory access, much like the Skylake X CPUs. As a result, the memory bandwidth has now been increased by 50% over Ryzen 7, and now Threadripper is on par with the Core i9 7900X. Memory performance is looking good, so let's move on to check out CPU performance with Cinebench. Well, as promised by AMD, the 1950X is good for a multi-threaded score of over 3,000 points. We saw 3,028 points, which is pretty incredible. That's a 39% increase over the i9 7900X, both of which do of course cost $1,000 US. The Core i9 CPU was, however, 10% faster for the single-threaded test, though that's not exactly the point of these CPUs. The 1920X was also 13% faster than the 7900X and 40% faster than the i7 7820X, so a clear win here for AMD in terms of price versus performance. Before moving on to the more serious benchmarks, I just wanted to see how Threadripper stood up in PCMark 10, which looks at typical sort of office type workloads, so they're not very core heavy. To my surprise though, Threadripper scored very well in this test and did considerably better than the Core i9 7900X. Excel is another office type benchmark, but this one does utilize many threads, especially when running the extreme Monte Carlo simulation. Here the 1920X just edged out the 7900X, taking an impressive 1.86 seconds to complete the workload. That said, it was 12% sold in the 1950X, which took just 1.66 seconds, making it the fastest desktop CPU we've ever tested here. For those of you unaware, VeraCrypt is an open source utility for on-the-fly encryption and features optimized implementations of cryptographic hash functions and ciphers, which boosts performance on modern CPUs. It also supports parallelized encryption for multi-core systems, as well as hardware-accelerated AES to further improve performance. In short, it takes advantage of the many cores Threadripper has on offer, and we certainly see that here. When compared to the Core i9 7900X, the 1950X was 48% faster for the 50MB test and 35% faster for the 1GB test. The 1920X also easily beat the 7900X, delivering up to 25% more performance. Next up, we have non-encrypted compression and decompression performance using 7-zip. Whereas hyperthreading sees a similar level of efficiency when compressing and decompressing, SMT is significantly more efficient when doing decompression work. SMT boosts performance of Threadripper by around 15% for the compression workload, whereas it saw a massive 60% increase for decompression. Disabling SMT saw the 1950X deliver around 50,000 MIPS for both tests. However, with SMT enabled, the 1950X just beat the Core i9-7700X for the compression test, but crushed it by a 53% margin for the decompression test. Meanwhile, the 1920X matched the compression performance of the 7820X, but was 48% faster when comparing the decompression results. Overall, strong results here for AMD's new Threadripper CPUs. HandBrake is a very popular application for encoding video, and we've used it to convert a 4K H.264 video to 1080p using H.265 and recorded the average frame rate. The 1950X was 6% faster than the 7900X in this test. Not a huge gain, but given both CPUs cost the same amount, it's a good result for the Threadripper CPU. That said, the 1920X does cost 33% more than the 7820X, and yet it was just 5% faster here, so a less impressive result for AMD in that comparison. For me personally, the Premiere Pro CC results interest me the most, as I spend a lot of time rendering these 4K videos on my Core i7 6950X editing machine. Back when I first reviewed the Core i9-7900X, I said at the time I had planned to probably replace my 6950X with Threadripper. I had noted though at the time that the current version of Premiere Pro isn't that good at taking advantage of high core count CPUs, and as a result the 7900X was just 4% faster than the 6950X, so a bit of a disappointing result there for the Intel CPU. I should note that this benchmark is CUDA accelerated by using a GTX 1080 Ti, so keep that in mind. That said, there aren't a huge amount of effects in my videos for the GPU to accelerate. Given that the higher clock 7900X was just 4% faster than my 6950X, and both are 10-core parts, I was hopeful Threadripper could save me a bit more time. Well, needless to say, I was pleasantly surprised when the 1950X took just 128 seconds to render the 1 minute and 30 second sample video. That's a 12% improvement over the 7900X. Meanwhile, the 1920X was also just 7% slower than the 7900X, so it looks like my next build will indeed be a 1950X Threadripper CPU. Moving on to the rendering tests, we have Blender, and first we're running the Ryzen Graphic 27 test. Here the 1950X offered a massive 29% performance improvement over the 7900X. In fact, the 1920X was able to best the Core i9 CPU as well, albeit by a slim margin. In any case, a very strong result here for AMD, so let's move on to check out what the more extreme Blender workload has for us. The Gooseberry workload takes some serious firepower to complete in around half an hour, and we see this as the 1950X turns in a time of almost 32 minutes, but that's a decent improvement on the 36 minutes it took the Core i9-7900X. It's actually around a 13% improvement in fact. This time the Core i9 CPU does just beat the 1920X, though the margin was extremely slim. Corona comes as a standalone benchmark. It renders a fixed scene 6 times, and we take the time it takes to complete the entire task. This application loves threads. The more the merrier, and the quicker you'll be done and you can move on to something else. Here we see yet again that the 1920X is able to best the Core i9-7900X, even if it is only by a slim margin. Meanwhile, the 1950X races ahead, smashing the 7900X by a convincing 31% margin. POVRay is another ray tracer. It's been around for many years, and we're using the official benchmark for testing this application. Here the 1920X beats the i9-7900X by a rather convincing 10% margin, and that's AMD's best result yet. Meanwhile, the 1950X was a whopping 37% faster than the Core i9 CPU, and for those wondering, almost 90% faster than the 1800X. This concludes the productivity benchmarks. Time for a few quick games. Now, before we get into the gaming benchmarks, be aware that there are 2 different memory access modes for Threadripper, and they do impact gaming performance quite a bit. By default, the CPU is configured to use the distributed mode, which uses UMA, or Uniform Memory Access. This method works best for the productivity workloads just seen, and since this is the default configuration, I decided to test games using this method first, but I will also compare UMA and NUMA performance as well. So, first up we have Battlefield 1, and performance doesn't look great if I'm honest. That said, it doesn't really look bad either. The Threadripper CPUs deliver similar performance to that of the R7 1700. That does, however, make them quite a bit slower than the Skylake X CPUs, particularly the 7820X and 7900X. Also, please note though, for these games I have reduced the quality settings slightly to try and eliminate the GPU bottleneck. Moving to Total War Warhammer, we see some pretty ordinary performance, particularly in relation to Ryzen 7. It's possible the game will be updated to better support Threadripper. That said though, we are pushing over 100 FPS at all times, so while comparatively slow when compared to the 1800X and 7900X, Threadripper's not exactly slow though. The 1950X performed very well when testing with Ashes of the Singularity Escalation, basically matching the Core i9 7900X. Meanwhile, the 1920X wasn't that far behind the 7820X, and both Threadripper CPUs were much faster than the Ryzen 7 models. Moving on, previously we found that Ryzen 7 has proven to be very fast in Civilization 6, and while not as fast, Threadripper also performs very well in this title, beating the Intel CPUs. The last game we have time for is F1 2016, and here Threadripper slips behind the Ryzen 7 CPUs and well behind the Skylake X CPUs. Again, please note I have reduced the quality settings in-game down to high, again to try and remove the GPU bottleneck, even though we are using a GTX 1080 Ti at 1080p. Even so, with the quality preset reduced too high, we are seeing some pretty massive frame rates for the Intel processors. Okay, so as I just mentioned before getting into the gaming benchmarks that we just looked at, there are two different types of memory access modes for Threadripper. The distribute mode, which is enabled by default, uses uniform memory access, and again, so far all the gaming testing you've seen has used this mode. However, you can switch to local mode or non-uniform memory access, and this allows each of the Zeppelin dies to prioritize which cores access certain parts of the system memory, basically prioritizing the nearest cores, and this improves overall latency for gaming applications that tend to place a premium on fast memory access. So let's see how this impacts gaming performance as well as a few productivity workloads. Switching to NUMA has improved the Battlefield 1 performance, and now Threadripper is delivering similar frame rates to the Ryzen 7 1800X. In fact, the 1950X creeps ahead ever so slightly, and now isn't that much slower than the Core i7 7820X and Core i9 7900X. F1 2016 also sees decent gains when switching to NUMA, though this time it isn't able to match the Ryzen 7 1800X, and that means it's also well down on the Intel CPUs. Performance in Civilization 6 was already very good, and here we see when switching to NUMA, no extra performance was had. Looking at the application performance, we see a slight performance decline with POVRay. Nothing serious, but the UMA method works better here. Blender also saw a slight decline in performance. The 1950X was about 4% slower using NUMA. Lastly, we have the Corona test, and here NUMA and UMA enabled the same performance, so not much else really needs to be said. Let's move on to some power consumption figures. Power consumption is one area where AMD continues to surprise me. And I have to say, Intel's actually been quite surprising here as well recently, though for a totally different reason. Whereas the 10-core 7900X pushed total system consumption to an incredible 281 watts in the Corona benchmark, the 16-core 1950X reached just 257 watts, a 9% decrease in total system consumption. That's a truly impressive result for AMD, given the 1950X was faster in every single one of our productivity workloads, some by quite a significant margin, and yet it consumes less power. Meanwhile, the 1920X was extremely fuel efficient, consuming 26% less power than the 1950X and just 18% more than the 1800X. It also somehow consumed 15% less power than Intel's 6-core 7800X. Alright, let's move on to see how things heat up though, once we start overclocking. Using the Thermaltake Flowring RGB 360 TT Premium Edition all-in-one liquid cooler, damn, that's a serious mouthful, we found some pretty good temperatures with Threadripper. Using the factory installed TIM, the flow was fitted to the 1950X, with the CPU overclocked to 4 GHz for all 16 cores. Under full load, the system peaked at 88 degrees, and I actually thought that was pretty good given what we'd recently seen from the Core i9 7900X, which pretty much cooked our all-in-one cooler from Corsair. However, after removing the cooler and wiping away the TIM, we covered the entire copper base in paste and tried again. To my surprise, temperatures were reduced quite drastically, now peaking at 83.5 degrees, but often sitting at just 81 degrees. With the custom paste still applied, I reverted back to the stock out-of-the-box clock speeds, and now the 1950X was hitting just 71 degrees. For those wondering, temperatures seem to be much the same with the 1920X under the same conditions. As expected, the Threadripper CPUs were able to hit 4 GHz, but unfortunately, like Ryzen 7, weren't able to go beyond that point, at least not on all cores. It's possible with extreme voltages you might hit 4.1, maybe even 4.2 GHz like what we've seen with some Ryzen CPUs, but for 24/7 usage, 4 GHz looks to be the limit. Anyway, at 4 GHz, the 1950X spat out an incredible score of 3,408 points in Cinebench, though due to the way XFR works, this overclock actually slightly reduced the single thread performance because we're not hitting those 4.1, 4.2 XFR frequencies on a single core. You could probably fine tune the overclock to avoid this, but with time against us, we didn't play around too much with the overclocking. Overclock, the Blender render time for the 1950X was cut down by an impressive 11%, while the 1920X was reduced by 6%. This means even when overclocked, the Core i9-7900X wasn't much faster than the 1920X, and it wasn't able to match the stock 1950X in this application. Interestingly, this time when testing with Corona, the 1920X saw a massive 17% performance improvement when overclocked, while the 1950X was just 7% faster. This meant both overclocked Threadripper parts were much faster than the overclocked 7900X. Premiere brings us back to the kind of margins we previously saw in Blender. Here we find the 1950X was 9% faster once overclocked, while the 1920X was just 5% faster. This meant when testing with Premiere Pro CC, the 1920X did trail the Core i9-7900X, while the 1950X was quite a lot faster. Please note that the overclocking performance in Warhammer was tested using uniform memory access, and here the overclocks did little to boost performance. Finally, we have the overclocking power consumption figures, and here Threadripper looks quite good, I have to say, especially in relation to the Core i9-7900X, whereas the Intel CPU pushed total system consumption of 388 watts, the 1950X hit 358 watts, an 8% reduction for what was often a 20 to 30% increase in performance. For the price versus performance comparison, I've taken the current retail pricing for each CPU from Amazon, and you can find those links in the video description. First up, let's take a look at Blender. Here we see the Threadripper 1950X delivering the best performance, as it's situated the furthest right on our scatter plot, and as you can see, it also sits lower than the Core i9-7900X, making it the cheaper option. To give you a better idea of what's going on, here is a linear guide from the Ryzen 7 1700 to the Threadripper 1950X. Basically, CPUs positioned to the left of this line represent poorer value, while anything to the right is better in terms of price versus performance. This gives us a good idea of how things look between AMD's cheapest 8-core CPU and their new flagship part. As you can see, the Intel Core i7-7800X and 7820X are very competitive, while the 1920X offers the best overall value. In fact, the only CPU to deviate a notable difference from the line is the Core i9-7900X, and as it is to the left of the line, we find it to be rather poor value. Next up we have Corona, and this benchmark looks to be largely dominated by AMD. Throwing up our linear line shows that AMD's done a very good job here, as all 4 of their CPUs deliver a very similar price versus performance ratio. Meanwhile, Intel's best value offering here is the Core i7-7820X, while the 7800X and 7900X represent rather poor value. The POVRay price versus performance scatterplot looks remarkably similar to what we saw with Corona. Let's bring up that line again to show you what I mean. Again, we see that all 4 AMD processors are quite tight on the line, meaning they all deliver very similar value. Again, only the Core i7-7820X looks half decent from Intel, while the 7800X and 7900X represent very poor value. Finally, I wanted to check out price versus performance in Premiere Pro CC. As you can see, the AMD processors again look to be ahead, and bringing up our linear line certainly shows this to be the case. Yet again, we see that the Core i7-7820X does the best of the Skylake X CPUs, while the overpriced 7900X again represents very poor value. Well, now that was a lot of data, and it pretty much all pointed to one thing: total domination by AMD's new Threadripper CPUs. The only weakness was, once again, gaming, but there really is no point in buying Threadripper for gaming. Rather, if you're keen on gaming and you have $1,000 CPU money to play with, pocket the change and get a 7700K. The Core i7-7700K is significantly cheaper and much better suited for high-end gaming. In the future, when games do use more cores, you simply upgrade then to whatever makes sense for gaming. The The reason I've recommended the Ryzen 5 1600 over the 7700K in the past is down to the simple fact that the Ryzen processor is much cheaper, it's also available on a more affordable platform, and for 90% of gamers out there it will deliver the exact same experience. So in terms of bang for your buck, Ryzen wins. That said though, as I've also noted previously, if you want the ultimate gaming experience with maximum frame rates, the 7700K is the best option. Having said all that, it is worth noting that when it comes to gaming, Threadripper is more than capable, and it's likely much better than Intel Xeon Gold 6130, for example, a $1,900 US 16-core 32-thread server chip, which operates at a base frequency of just 2.1 GHz. Anyway, enough about gaming. That quite clearly isn't the point of these 12-core and 16-core CPUs. Productivity is the name of the game here, and for serious workloads, Ryzen has already proven to be a beast. Threadripper, though, takes things to a new level. We now have a $1,000 US processor from AMD, but when compared to the competition, it might actually be worth that asking price. We've had $1,000 desktop processors for quite some time now, but it's been a very long time since we've seen such an extreme desktop CPU from AMD, and yet at this price, I do believe they have the best offering in terms of price versus performance. In the case of Broadwell-E, Haswell-E, Ivy Bridge-E, and so on, Intel did hands down offer the best options for power users for the simple fact that they were the only choice. So for the past 5+ years, Intel has kind of just won by default. Back when Intel had no competition, the pricing of their early Extreme Edition CPUs did bother me, but how can you complain when there's simply no alternative? Then by the time Haswell-E came around, we'd all kind of just accepted the $1,000 asking price for an Intel flagship part, and at the time that was an 8-core 16-thread beast. Then Broadwell-E came around and, well, Intel obviously couldn't imagine a world where they would return to competition, so they went completely wild with pricing, and we ended up with a 6950X at $1,700 US. Now though, things are very different. Although Skylake X is still technically out in front when comparing CPUs of the same core count, it doesn't really matter. As I've said time and time again, absolute performance isn't everything, and that's not what I focus on with my reviews. I'm 100% all about that price versus performance ratio. I review things as though I'm going to buy them myself. And having recently purchased a Core i7-7800X and an Asus X299 motherboard for testing, I'm still feeling the sting. Let me be clear though, the Skylake X architecture and the X299 platform actually isn't that bad. Yes, there are a few head-scratching aspects, but overall it does work very well. The problem for me is the price, or at least the price versus performance. In terms of pricing, Skylake X has certainly improved, but as I said in my previous video comparing the 7820X and R7-1700, we've kind of just gone from stupid pricing to a little less stupid. Meanwhile, AMD's come out of nowhere and decided they actually do want some market share, and the strategy to win it back? Seriously aggressive pricing. Threadripper, while certainly a lot more expensive than Ryzen 7, kind of continues with the lowball pricing, and this is a big problem for Intel. In a way, the core count kind of becomes somewhat irrelevant at this point. The Core i9-7900X and Threadripper 1950X both have a lot of cores, and they both cost $1,000. The difference being that the 1950X was often found delivering 20 to 30% more performance while consuming almost 10% less power under full load. So in a nutshell, for the same price, you get a heck of a lot more CPU, more performance, lower power consumption, and improved operating temperatures. So in conclusion, why would you buy a Core i9-7900X over this glued together 1950X? I don't know, but that's Intel's problem. Intel did just announce the official specifications for their 12, 14, 16, and 18 core Skylake X parts. And based on what they announced, at a guess I would say consumers will need to spend at least $1,400 US to acquire the i9-7940X to match AMD's 1950X, and I seriously doubt the 40% price premium will be worth it. The other big issue the X299 platform faces, other than the extreme price, is its complete lack of ECC memory support. Whereas Threadripper supports ECC memory, Skylake X chips don't, and that means anyone serious about their workstation won't even consider Intel's high-end desktop platform. Unless Intel's willing to move on pricing, and I'm quite certain they're not, I can't see why anyone would invest in the X299 platform, and that's my honest opinion. Who would have thought that in 2017 AMD would come back and completely knock Intel off their high-end desktop perch? Certainly wasn't me, but I'm super glad we have some competition back. I can't recall a time when it was more exciting to be a PC enthusiast. And on that note, I'm going to end this rather long review. I'm your host Steve. I'll see you guys again real soon because I have put together some simulated Threadripper 1950X benchmarks. You're not going to want to miss those.